Welcome, intrepid political scientists. I'm going to start with a brief review of scientific principles from last time. In fact, it would be helpful if you had your Civics Lesson 3 notes handy, because these first couple slides, most of the information you could probably just fill in if you missed something important from your Lesson 3, and then we'll get to the new stuff. So we've seen that science is a body of knowledge, a massive information that we build systematically through empiricist epistemology. That is, how do we know what we think we know? Well, we use empiricism. That is, we're going to focus on detectable, quantifiable evidence that we can verify with our senses and count if necessary. Using the scientific method of observation and experimentation that has been refined over the last several centuries, starting in earnest with there's Galileo, the great astronomer, and Sir Isaac Newton, very early scientific revolution figures. Newton was a physicist. And then Charles Darwin in the 19th century, a biologist. Also in the 19th century, Marie Curie, a chemist and physicist. Into the 20th century, we get Albert Einstein, also a physicist, and Stephen Hawking, a cosmologist. This stuff works, and it doesn't just work for natural science, it works for social science. It works for studying people. We need to talk a little bit more about scientific standards of evidence. Here again, this is review, and in every case, we're looking at inferior versus superior evidence, but I want you to think of inferior evidence as still may be good, still may be useful, less good maybe, versus superior evidence being evidence that is probably or certainly much better. Now, we talked about secondary sources, secondhand news, versus primary, first-hand eyewitness testimony or documents produced by the people in question. Obviously, the latter better than the former. Subjective, which we're defining here as something that is claimed by just one person or by a few people, versus the more people you have claiming something, the more confidence you have that it's objective. But that even that is not necessarily a slam dunk, right? Sometimes one or a few people possess insights that other people don't have, which is why we look at amateur versus expert. And in every case, we have to look at availability, right? As a historian, we'd always like in history to use primary sources if we've got them, but especially in ancient medieval history, sometimes all we've got are secondary sources, and if that's all you got to use it. And another thing to consider with subjective versus objective, and it's not enough just to count heads, not just because of expertise, but also because sometimes, people have an agenda. More on that in a bit. Generally speaking, anonymous information is less reliable than sourced information, right? If someone is willing to stand behind their testimony in public, we value that. But if all we've got is anonymous information, we'll go with that, but we'll take it with a grain of salt. Now, I want to talk about bias. All we can ever do is talk about degrees of bias, right? There's no such thing as a totally biased and therefore useless source, nor is there such a thing as a completely unbiased source. Every source is some degree of biased, right? So it is not profound analysis to respond to any bit of information by saying it's biased, right? What you want to talk about is in what way is it biased? To what degree is it biased? Right. For example, imagine, let's come back to the concept of few versus many, and loop in the bias concept. Let's imagine a person claims that they're being picked on. They're being picked on maybe because of their gender identity or sexual orientation, maybe because of their race or religion, right? It doesn't really matter, what the reason for they're being persecuted is, but imagine this person is, giving a report, right? And they're complaining that they're being harassed by a large number of people because of their religion or their political beliefs or the other protected categories that I mentioned a minute ago, right? And so they're complaining to, I don't know, the police. And, so let's just choose one. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that it's a gay person claiming that they're being picked on by a group of people who are homophobes. And if they make this report to the police, and the police are like, well, you're biased because, after all, you are gay, right? So, you don't really have room to complain, right? That's not reasonable, right? I mean, a person, if we required a third-party witness in every case, then a lot of cases of discrimination would never get followed up on, right? So, it's possible that a subjective claim by a person, does it create bias to be the member of a protected category, right? If a person is getting picked on for being a particular religion and they are a member of that religious group, does that mean they have no right to complain? No, that would be silly, right? So we weigh bias, right? We weigh WEIGH, all of these things, right? Because any piece of evidence we're going to analyze on all of these different axes of secondary versus primary, subjective versus objective, amateur versus expert, anonymous versus sourced, more biased versus less biased. And there's more. Unreliable versus reliable, right? If a source is historically unreliable, right? If there's a website that often promotes falsehoods, or a person who lies a lot, well, that experience of that source being unreliable is going to lead us to discount claims in the future from that site or that person. Conversely, if a publication or a website or a person is consistently reliable, consistently truthful, then we're going to put more stock in future claims from that person of established, or site or source of established reliability. We talked before about vague claims being hard to assess versus specific claims being susceptible of assessment. And this is closely connected to the scientific concept of falsifiability, which is associated with this guy, Karl Popper, a great 20th century philosopher of science. The other guy on the slide, of course, is our man Aristotle, the great scientist and political scientist of ancient history. Anyhow, falsifiability is, well, in order to be we can't assess a claim unless we can. It's possible to prove it false, right? Like, if someone asserts God is good, right? Well, that's something that a lot of us believe, but it's really hard to assess, right? It's God by definition is supernatural, so the tools of empiricism, of observing the natural world, are unavailable to us, right? It's a question beyond science, right? As opposed to, the claim of, well, Obama was born in Kenya, not in Hawaii. Well, that's a falsifiable claim, right? We can assess this, and it was assessed. The witnesses and documents were unanimous that, in fact, Barack Obama was born in Hawaii. So scientists pose and answer falsifiable questions, right? If it can't be proven false, then it can't be proven true. In fact, in science, including political science, nothing can absolutely be proven true, right? The things that we accept as true are the undefeated assertions, right? We have tried really hard to falsify them. We've tried really hard to disprove them, and they have survived all of those efforts at falsification. Oh, now, I'm going to talk about the QAnon conspiracy fantasy, because it is a clinic in why the scientific standards of evidence work when we use them and help us identify clear falsehoods. If whoever constructed the Q concept had this, it's like they had this list and decided to violate every one of them, right? It is based on secondary, subjective amateur, anonymous, highly biased, historically unreliable, vague, and often unfalsifiable allegations. It all started with Pizzagate. Back in 2016, during the presidential election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, this meme surfaces on the internet, this idea that Hillary Clinton and her friends, political and financial elites, were in fact Satan worshippers who kidnapped and enslaved children. They were pedophiles, right? No evidence for this, but it's running rampant around the internet. And the allegation was that this pizzeria, pictured here, the basement of this pizzeria was the headquarters of this Satanist child sex slave ring. Well, that's weird, right? That seems really outlandish. Now, the media did their job. News outlets from the New York Times to Fox News investigated and came away with no factual support for this. This is entirely bogus. So that's it, right? No. There were websites like InfoWars promoting it. It was going around social media channels. General Flynn, who worked in the Trump presidential campaign and served for 22 days as Trump's national security advisor, also promoted this idea. There's General Flynn, and there's InfoWars website. And this resulted in a whole lot of harassment of the pizzeria, threats against the employees, people flaming them on Yelp, consistent harassment, but not just harassment. It led to an attack on the pizzeria. This guy on the right was in North Carolina, and he was digging all this stuff on the internet, and he decided to go investigate to save the children from this Satanist child sex slave ring. Now, he went in there and opened fire, including firing through a closed door, which is an odd thing to do if you think that you're rescuing children. Anyway, it turns out the pizzeria didn't have a basement. Now, thank God nobody was injured. This guy's arrested. He's doing his 4-year sentence still. And, well, so that's the end of it, right? I mean, there was actually a falsifiable element, right? The headquarters was supposed to be in the basement of the pizzeria. The pizzeria doesn't have a basement. Well, it's not finished, right? Like, a couple weeks after the attack, there's a poll. And the pollsters are asking if the leaked Clinton emails during the campaign. See, the allegation said that there were coded messages in the leaked Clinton emails that were coded messages about the pedophilia and the Satanism and the child trafficking. And so the poll is asking people about that. Clinton voters, like 1 out of 6 Clinton voters were like, oh yeah, that happened. Almost half of all Trump voters were like, oh yeah, that Pizzagate thing is real, right? So this has been, thoroughly debunked by newspapers across the political spectrum. There's been this high-profile incident that shows that an important element of the conspiracy fantasy is false, and yet you still have alarmingly high numbers of people saying this is a thing. And it gets worse. Instead of going away as elements are disproven, it morphs into something bigger, an online conspiracy fantasy called QAnon. Now, Q is supposedly a person who works in the federal government and has access to classified information, and it's like Pizzagate, but bigger. In the next part, we will talk about just how big it is.